This is Latter-day Presentations, where we discuss topics and issues of faith for Latter-day Saints. Welcome back. Here we're going to continue our discussion of paradigms and how those impact scholarship. We're going to focus on worldview here. Now, what is worldview? Worldview is a set of stories that we tell ourselves about how the world works and how it should work. For example, how relationships should be, what is just or fair, what constitutes the good life, whether there is a God and how God thinks and operates, and what is the ideal ordering of society. These are just some of many components of our worldviews, and worldview greatly impacts biblical scholarship. Here's a quote from Latter-day Saint biblical scholar Phil Barlow on assumptions. Now, I'll just say here that Phil Barlow, his book Mormons and the Bible, was basically my first real exposure to questions around the Bible for Latter-day Saints and how it has been received throughout the Restoration. So he is an important voice in my personal study, and I highly recommend his book. I love this quote of his. I think there's a lot to it, so pay attention here. He says, for example, some critics steeped in modern assumptions may exceed necessary critical thought by too facilely discounting the witness of earlier generations as self-evidently a product of wish fulfillment. Rather than suspending judgment, they may start with the post-Enlightenment assumption that miracles, say the resurrection, cannot have happened, because such things do not happen. No one they respect has witnessed one. The fact that gospel writers report stories of the resurrection and that claimants surrendered their lives for belief in it thus warrants no pause. Paul's claim to have encountered the risen Jesus is dismissed, despite the fact that he changed his fundamental beliefs because of it and gave his life for it. The Jesus Seminar famously goes so far as to imply that a majority vote system by its participants is a good way of determining what really happened and what Jesus historically did and did not say. Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan appears only in the Gospel according to Luke, but the seminar votes it among the most likely to be authentically from Jesus, according to criteria it previously fashioned. The seminar's conclusions are not ipso facto wrong, but its procedure does risk fashioning a lens that is in fact a mirror. Now, what does Phil Barlow mean by a lens that is in fact a mirror? Well, we all have a tendency to project our own views onto people of the past, and that is absolutely applicable in the field of biblical studies. Barlow talked about people who deny miracles and so forth, and if that is your paradigm, then obviously as you approach the text, you're going to be very constrained as far as your possibilities in understanding the text and in conducting any kind of historical analysis of the text. Now let's talk about historical criticism and weird worldviews. Now when I say the word weird, I mean Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. So people in the United States and Western Europe and places like that, we tend to have a specific collection of worldviews that differ greatly from people in other parts of the world. And here's a great quote from R.S. Sugirtharaja. He says, I would like to make it clear that my attitude toward historical criticism is one of an ambivalence. On the one hand, I would like to affirm the historical method, and I can see its benefits, but on the other, I can see its damaging effects when it is transferred to other parts of the world, and especially when it is used to conquer and subjugate other people's texts and stories and cultures. Though historical criticism was liberative, particularly to the Western white and middle classes, it had a shackling and enslaving impact on women, blacks, and people of other cultures, as the recent exegetical works of these groups have manifestly demonstrated. Here's John Barton. He says, biblical criticism, it is alleged, has worked with a false self-image of objectivity and unprejudiced detachment, when in fact it has represented the interests of first world scholars rather than of people in the developing world, and of men rather than women. The interpretations to which it has led have been slanted. The charge being leveled against biblical critics is not simply that they have come to the wrong conclusions by the use of methods that might be, in themselves, perfectly acceptable in more skillful hands. It is that the methods themselves are fatally flawed. The whole ideal of objectivity, of simply reading what is quote unquote actually there in the text, deceives. In reality, what is being practiced is eisegesis, reading one's own attitudes into the text, thereby doing violence to it and turning it into a vehicle for violence itself. Violence against the oppressed, whether the poor or women or some other minority, actually majority community. Now, here in parentheses, he says actually majority. We're going to look at some more voices from the majority world and see that they agree largely with his analysis here. He says the charge is a grave one, not to be set aside by pleading that no such effect was intended, for good intentions are not enough to excuse lamentable blindness to the effects of one's actions. This attack on biblical criticism, as the academic world of biblical scholarship has received, is not to be ignored with a superior smile. Here's an excellent quote from Ekaputra Tupamahu. He talks about whiteness, and when we use that word, some of you viewers might bristle a little bit. Maybe if you have conservative politics and you're worried about woke terminology, I would just ask you at this point to set that aside and kind of bracket those ways of thinking for a moment. And let's listen to what he and some of these other scholars have to say. Their voices are speaking from the majority world, and they have a very different perspective than a lot of people in North America and Scandinavia and Western Europe. So let's hear what they have to say. Tupamahu says, because whiteness lies at the center of biblical studies, the accepted way of doing biblical scholarship is one that engages white questions, white concerns. The system forces scholars of color, especially those who receive their doctoral trainings in the Western educational system, to be familiar with white scholarship. In the United States, a doctoral student has to pass a comprehensive or qualifying exam after taking their coursework. And in many schools, the materials for the comprehensive exams are a huge stack of books written by white scholars. Being able to read German and French is a minimum requirement that every doctoral student has to pass. You may ask, why German and French? Why not Urdu or Korean or Chinese? Well, because those are the primary languages, along with the assumed English, in which white biblical scholarship is written. In short, the capacity to be familiar with white scholarship is technically the goal of the scholarly training. To be a biblical scholar is to be white. Biblical scholarship training is a whitewashing machine. He continues, before I give an example of the invisible white concern or question that shapes the thrust of modern New Testament scholars, a few words need to be said first about the politics of publication and citation. Major journals such as the New Testament Studies, Novum Testamentum, Catholic Biblical Quarterly, Journal of Biblical Literature, and many others are crowded with white scholars. Rarely does one see scholars of color publish in those venues. The guardian angels of these journals, the peer reviewers, are mostly white scholars who filter what gets in and what does not. The peer reviewing process is a disciplinary power mechanism, to borrow a concept from Michel Foucault, that controls and disciplines the discourses in biblical scholarship. Discourses that are outside the acceptable white desire are pushed out or shaped to conform to whiteness. And another quote from Tupamahu. He says, another recent example is worth mentioning. Larry Hurtado published his Journal for the Study of the New Testament article in 2014 with a similar tone, predicting the future of New Testament studies. Unsurprisingly, the entire discussion is centered around white biblical scholarship in both Europe and North America. Toward the end of the article, Hurtado discusses postcolonial studies, after stating that postcolonialism is, quote, one of the commendable developments in the field over the last several decades, end quote, and that, quote, we can all learn, end quote, from their critique of Western scholarship. Hurtado immediately dismisses its importance by saying that, quote, based on my own experience with postgraduate students from various countries and cultures, I doubt that postcolonialist interpretation of the New Testament will prove to be the typical, or at least not the dominant approach taken by scholars in non-Western settings, end quote. What is the cause of this doubt? Hurtado states further, most of these emerging scholars identify themselves strongly as Christian and associate with churches in their home countries. And for them, New Testament writings continue to be regarded as scriptures. This is really important here. Pay attention to what he just said. Here is a New Testament scholar in Larry Hurtado who waved off the validity and the value and the importance of a massive amount of scholarship from the majority world because so many of those emerging scholars identify themselves as Christian and they bring faith commitments to their scholarship. Tupamahu continues. He says, to describe postcolonialism as being in direct opposition to being Christian and to association with churches is a serious misunderstanding of what postcolonial theory is trying to achieve. Postcolonialism is critical of the relationship between Christianity and colonialism, but it is not a negation of Christianity. It is no surprise that there are many Christian postcolonial thinkers. For Hurtado, it is clear that we refers to white scholars. And finally, Tupamahu says, let me now turn to the synoptic problem as an example of the persistent invisibility of whiteness in New Testament studies. Anybody who studies the New Testament, especially after the 19th century, cannot escape the synoptic problem. It is discussed in every book on New Testament introduction, in commentaries, monographs, scholarly journal articles, etc. It is omnipresent in the study of the Gospels today. My first encounter with this so-called problem was when I was doing my undergraduate studies in Indonesia. It was quite a surprise to me at that time because I had never regarded the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke as a quote-unquote problem. Why does this relationship among the Gospels somehow become a problem? Whose problem is it? These are questions that have bothered me for many years. The longer I study it, the more I realize that this is an exclusively white problem. The synoptic problem is a retrojection of whiteness into biblical texts. That's a very, very sharp statement here from Ekaputra Tupamahu. And I would add, as we proceed further, we're going to see the same exact thing with questions around the authorship of Isaiah. Now let's look at this quote from Denise Kimber Buell. She says, as Jacqueline Hidalgo rightly notes, academic fields at large, but perhaps biblical studies especially, are circumscribed by a certain politics of reading, the acceptable canon of scholarly sources within any particular field, the authority that adheres to the reading of certain texts and not others, and the practices of authorization that surround and enable only certain ways of reading these texts. We see the effects of these habits also in our professional societies. Among the program units at Society of Biblical Literature conferences, some have a visible interpretive approach: ideological criticism, LGBTQ hermeneutics, Paul and politics, ecological hermeneutics, feminist hermeneutics of the Bible, where others do not: Pauline epistles, Book of Acts, Gospel of Luke, etc. The audience and panelists at these unmarked sessions are, not coincidentally, overwhelmingly white and male. Our citational practices reveal much about which interpretive approaches we value and function to transmit generationally a narrow genealogy of legitimate voices. I use the reproductive imagery deliberately. Too often these citational practices erase voices that are not white. Here's Wei Shen Wen. She says, in a recent essay, Dean Galbraith draws attention to the ways in which 19th century racialized models of cultural evolution continue to shape contemporary scholarship with regard to Numbers 13 through 14. By means of a survey of the history of scholarship on this passage, Galbraith argues that historical criticism's racially based foundations have become embedded and disguised within what is purported a purely text-based analysis of the spy narrative. What I am most interested in the racialized world in which biblical studies began, is not the racial categories themselves, but rather the way in which Europe again and again emerges as the center of this world, as the pinnacle of progress and learning. Biblical studies at the present time remains a largely European project, in which non-European voices remain subordinated as other. The latter can participate under regulated conditions, that is, insofar as they approximate whiteness, the unmarked particularity of the white European norm that universalizes its own perspective and measures others against it. but always in such a way as to remain on the periphery. As long as this is true, biblical studies will always have a race problem. She continues, the second marker of biblical studies Eurocentrism centers on the idea of objectivity. Despite widespread and long-standing acceptance of the notion that all exegesis is shaped by presuppositions, by convictions, and by context, there nonetheless remains a common commitment to the idea that exegesis should be governed as far as possible by the ideal of objectivity. In this context, objectivity primarily means the notion that it is possible to ascertain, and that scholarly effort is best exerted to ascertain what the text actually meant to its original author and or original readers, i.e. an authentic meaning. This is often contrasted to less authentic meanings assigned to it by later readers, such as the institutionalized Constantinian Church, medieval scholastics, modern fundamentalist preachers, contemporary political discourse, and so on. The very concept of a text's objective meaning, so crucial to the post-Reformation project, as we have seen, engenders a complex epistemological problem. Annibal Quijano has argued that the view of knowledge as the relationship between a subject and an object is itself a distinctly, though perhaps not exclusively, European way of construing rationality from Descartes' cogito. For the purposes of this essay, however, I will focus on one particular aspect of objectivity, what it implies about the knowing subject. In order to discern objective meaning, the knowing subject is construed as someone who is not bound or conditioned by his own subjectivity. The male pronoun here is chosen deliberately. Let the reader understand. Okay, pause and let's revisit what she just said. Okay, pause and let's revisit what she just said. It's so interesting and important. She says the knowing subject is construed as someone who is not bound or conditioned by his own subjectivity. The male pronoun here is chosen deliberately. Let the reader understand. What she's hinting at is that males, and especially white males, we have a tendency to claim objectivity for the things that we undertake in biblical studies and also other areas of life. We, for some reason, tend to think that there is this thing called objectivity in what we do. And we're always looking for the objective analysis as opposed to the subjective analyses of things. She's really pointing out that, yes, this is a very male tendency. And I think she's right. Let's continue. What a scholar means when he claims to offer an objective reading, or a reading that is as close to objective as possible, of a biblical text, is that even though he works within a discipline whose methods and boundaries are shaped and delineated by European history and experience, his methods and results are untainted by these parameters, or at least they transcend the limits of this particularity. Our quest for this meaning is already inflected by our situatedness in time and space, and by the whole European cargo of this modern discipline we call biblical studies. The kinds of questions we ask, even who gets to define what is or is not a respectable question, the media by which we ask them, and the tools we use to answer them, all of these remain predominantly Eurocentric. Now, some concluding thoughts for this section. Worldview greatly influences choices that scholars make. And worldview is largely shaped by culture. The differences between Western Enlightenment cultural assumptions and those of the global majority are very consequential in matters of faith and scholarship. Okay? The field of biblical studies has long operated from the assumption that typically Western white male notions of rationality are the standard for the field, and other interpretive approaches belong at the periphery. And I'm going to offer a prediction here that these views offered here by people from the global majority are going to win out in this debate. And over time, and I believe it might be as soon as a generation, a lot of these operating theories from the field of biblical studies that did emerge from a white European worldview are going to be abandoned. And I think that probably includes the theory of multiple authorship of Isaiah. And a quick reminder as we conclude here, These slides are available for download on Nauvoo Neighbor. You can go and grab these slides and use them however you please. I hope this segment has been helpful to you. This has been an episode of Latter-day Presentations. We would like to remind viewers that our channel represents our own views and not necessarily any official positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We hope this presentation has been informative. Our notes for this show are at Nauvoo Neighbor, and the link can be found in the show description. Also in the show description, we have a link to provide feedback. If you would like to suggest a topic for discussion, or if you would like to contribute a presentation on a topic of interest to you, let us know. Thanks again for joining us.